So I started out with a very broad idea of assessment. Um, we talked about how assessment should be reliable, fair, and valid, and equitable in one of the first readings we did. So that's kind of what I focused on for this first web of assessment. From previous classes, I knew that there was formative and summative and informal and formal assessments. I knew that they should be higher order thinking, contain questioning. I knew that there was a self assessment and peer assessments because I've done that before in classes. And then I knew some assessment types. So I had end of grade tests, which I consider like the biggest assessment because that's kind of what we did in school was teach the test. And that's what our end goal was, to pass the EOGs. But then I also knew that there was like essay types assessments and multiple choice. I don't know why I didn't put multiple choice in here. Oh, interesting. I knew that there were different learning levels and groups for assessment. A word I associated with assessment was evaluate, and I knew that they were supposed to show growth. So this is my first web of assessment. Here's my second one. Stuff I added down here because I could not find the website that I made this first web on, so I added it in Word in these new boxes. So by the time we did the second web of assessment, we had started learning about question types in the class. So constructive response and selected response questions. I learned a lot about how to write these questions, especially selected response. One thing that I was really surprised about is that you're not supposed to trick the students. I learned that in the multiple choice, matching, binary, the selected response questions. I was so surprised when I read that because I felt like my teachers had been tricking me my entire life, and I would always second guess myself when taking tests because I thought the question was tricky. So I'm glad to know that that is not the best practice and that we are not supposed to trick our students. So that was one big thing I learned in this assessment, or in this web of assessment that I added. Also learned that you can, alongside the rubric, which I already had, I learned that you can grade based on a checklist and then criteria. I learned the important parts of a rubric, which was very helpful because I don't think we'd ever been taught how to make a proper rubric before. It was important to have like what is expected of the students on the rubric. And I totally understand that because as a student, I want to know what I'm going to be graded on. So why wouldn't I make that rubric for my future students where they know exactly what I'm expecting and what point values are allowed for each area. So that was very, very interesting to me. And then the constructive responses I added on this web, completion and short answer. Those questions are so important, I feel like. I feel like you can demonstrate more knowledge in those types of assessments. However, they can be judged differently because you can be biased as a teacher, I suppose. And so that's when your teacher judgment really comes into handy. I know I learned a lot about this in my interview with my classroom teacher about how she uses effort in some of her assignments. So these are a little tricky, but I do feel like it can be easier for students to show what they actually know in those type of questions instead of guessing in a multiple choice. And now my third web of assessment with a ton of stuff on it. So at the top, the differentiation. You have to differentiate your assessments. That should be common sense to me, but I did not have that on my chart. One thing I wanted to especially add was the academically gifted and talented, because you don't really think about that when you're planning, but academically gifted and talented is also a need for students, and so you have to assess them differently because they need that. Another thing I can't believe I didn't add was that assessment is not always a test. Assessments can be fun. They can be a quick, just assessing that students know what you're talking about or that they understand the instructions. It can be a quick observation of what students are doing at the moment in their group discussions. And one thing I really liked that I learned from my interview was calling it a show what you know. So in kindergarten, students don't need to be pressured by the term test. They love to show the teacher what they know. So if you call your assessments a show what you know, they'll be super excited and try their best on the test, and it won't have all the pressure of a test. I wish that would continue for all the grade levels. Maybe it would make it a little less stressful, but I think that's great. Also learn about standard-based assessments. I always thought that everything was just standardized tests. That's what I'd always heard. So it was interesting to know that there's also standards-based assessments, which are the EOGs in the end of grade or end of course test. So that was very interesting. It makes sense because they're based on the standards taught in school. Still not a big fan, but they are there and they are a part of assessment. And that is my web of assessments, all 3 of them. I really learned a lot from this course. I definitely did not know all of this at the beginning. I learned a lot about making rubrics, a lot about differentiation, a lot about how to make a fair assessment, and I really had a great time in this class.